A sealed concrete plug sits set into the earth beneath a ruin, an ordinary scrap of masonry, scabbed with lichen and time. A rusted padlock hangs from a bracket. A stamped inspection mark, half erased, glints in the late light. A single man walks up the slope with keys in his pocket and a clipboard in his hand. He pauses, reads the date carved into a plaque, runs his fingers over cold metal, and looks for a moment like someone who has been keeping a promise he did not make alone. Beneath that plain stone, the whisper of something vast and dangerous has been preserved in silence for decades. The question that follows is simple and heavy. What promise waited so long to be kept? The man's name in official files is the kind that appears beside routine checklists: state geologist, site custodian, maintenance inspector. He is not a politician, a headline, or a historian. He is the person the bureaucracy delegates to a place the world would rather forget. He unlocks a small hatch for a routine inspection. He checks for water seepage, for cracks, for the signs of structural collapse that might let the old past leak back into the present. He records temperatures and notes. He ticks boxes. Yet his hands move with a different kind of care than one would expect from mere infrastructure. The job description is technical. The work is moral. This sealed room, concrete poured and hammered into permanence, was not built to be a museum exhibit. It was built in haste and secrecy, as part of a vast wartime program that sought to move human industry out of the open and into the rock. As Allied bombers grew more effective, the Nazi leadership ordered machines, labor, and materials placed on their ground, beneath domes of reinforced concrete and in tunnels that spidered beneath hills and ridgelines. The aim was straightforward: keep production alive when the skies were no longer safe. The means were brutal. What civil engineers dreamed of as protective architecture became in practice a network of forced labor, suffering, and hidden atrocity. The scale of those plans is difficult to imagine without stepping back into the maps and photographs that ran across intelligence desks in the 1940s. Reconnaissance images show clusters of cut rock, plan outlines of cavernous halls, the circular shadows of domes where concrete was poured in layers as thick as a man is tall. Engineers sketched assembly halls for jet fighters, bays for rocket motors, rails for moving heavy components. Albert Speer, as Minister of Armaments, oversaw the direction, the imperative to keep the armament stream flowing consumed strategy. Hans Kammler, whose title linked engineering, construction, and the SS, coordinated the massed building programs that drew in companies, architects, and, critically, the coerced labor of those the regime had already stripped of rights and names. Those tunnels were not built by volunteers.
Their bones were laid by people pressed into service, prisoners of concentration camps, foreign civilians seized from occupied territories, men and women who knew little of the machinery they were forced to help create. They were fed poorly, clothed thinly, and driven by guards who measured worth by output rather than humanity. At the entrances to some of these sites, makeshift barracks grew up to house a workforce that was never meant to be comfortable. Inside, the work was backbreaking: drilling, blasting, lugging, hauling, setting timbers, pouring concrete by hand where formwork was improvised, welding and assembling under the glow of inadequate light. The air, in the most crowded passages, tasted of damp stone and diesel fumes. It was thick with dust that settled in the lungs of those who breathed it. Many became too weak to rise. How many died in those places is not a number easily or responsibly written. Records are incomplete, scattered, or deliberately destroyed. Historians speak of thousands, of many, of loss on a scale that defies neat accounting. The exact tally remains unknown. A composite of survivor recollections, drawn from dozens of interviews recorded after the war, captures the cadence of what daily life inside these projects looked like. One voice, shaped from several testimonies, recalls work that began before dawn and continued past dusk, a relentless rhythm of labor that left little room for rest or thought. "We were sent down into the dark to build what our captors needed," the composite memory says. "We slept on planks. We ate bread that was not enough. We were counted by the number who did not make it to the next morning." That kind of sentence is not an embellishment. It is the recurring note in dozens of preserved accounts. The moral center of the underground program is not in the concrete or the machinery. It is lodged in those human voices, thin, persistent, and indelible. Technically, the work aimed to preserve and accelerate German military innovation. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had been a technological leap with the potential to contest Allied air superiority. Plans were made to move its production into hardened halls where it could be assembled away from bombing runs. Rocket technology, led by figures like Wernher von Braun and his team, became a parallel obsession. The V-2, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, was not merely a weapon, it was a symbol of a new age in warfare. Engineers and planners envisaged subterranean production lines where warheads could be assembled and engines tested away from surveillance. At the same time, companies like IG Farben were implicated in chemical ventures, and there were documented programs to explore agents such as sarin, whether for research, manufacture, or stockpiling.
Those plans were terrifying in potential, but crucially must be mentioned as plans and risks rather than as operational blueprints. Much was experimental, much was incomplete, and many projects never reached the point where their hypothetical impact could be judged with certainty. To understand why the regime invested in such desperate engineering, one must imagine the forces bearing down on Germany in the late stages of the war. Allied bombing had transformed the map of European industry. Rail yards, factories, and ports were frequent targets, and the production that could be defended in subterranean caverns promised continuity. Yet the choice to bury industry was as much a moral decision as a strategic one. It demanded human sacrifice in the form of forced labor, and it made the architecture of industry complicit in atrocity. The machinery was never neutral. It was embedded in a system that valued output over life. Allied intelligence began to register the scale of subterranean works through aerial reconnaissance and intercepted reports. Photographs taken from high altitude revealed mouths to tunnels, the circular scars of domes, and rail lines that led to seemingly blank hillsides. Analysts pieced together blueprints from fragments, tracing the outlines of planned facilities for Me-262 assembly, V-2 component production, and ball bearing factories relocated away from vulnerable surface plants. Where possible, attacks followed. The RAF 617 Squadron, famed for the Dambusters raid, was among the units tasked with precision operations aimed at disrupting those efforts. Strikes rendered some sites unusable, collapsing unfinished chambers or destroying essential machinery before it could be protected by concrete. The interplay of reconnaissance and intervention meant that not all plans reached fruition. Many installations were left half-built. The concrete domes poured over empty vaults in anticipation of machinery that never arrived. Other sites were rendered useless by targeted bombing, but the human infrastructure, prisoners and laborers, remained at risk until the front lines shifted. The moral ambiguity of those actions remains a subject of scholarly debate. Would truly subterranean production have changed the course of the conflict? Some historians argue that had the regime achieved full-scale underground manufacturing, it might have prolonged the war by maintaining certain levels of output. Others suggest that logistical constraints, resource shortages, and the breadth of Allied economic power made any decisive reversal unlikely. The point is not a counterfactual to be resolved here, but a cautionary thought. The temptation to imagine a technological fix that could have preserved a criminal regime obscures the reality that those fixes were built on exploitation. As the war ended, so did some of the construction and some of the labor. In many places, work stopped abruptly.
Machinery left half-installed gathered dust. Scaffolding stood like harvests of metal against bare rock. In the immediate aftermath, occupying forces faced choices about these half-finished installations. Some were stripped of equipment and repurposed for storage or industrial use during reconstruction. Others were methodically sealed with concrete plugs and buried entrances, a practical measure to prevent accidents and to contain potential hazards. Is one particular kind of sealing, deliberate, official, long-term, that gives our narrative its center. Not the hurried barricade of an immediate military action, but the official decision to concrete over spaces, and in doing so, to consign certain truths to the ground. Those seals were practical, ceremonial in their finality, and always in tension with memory. A plug of concrete can keep the scene secure from collapse, or it can be used to hide the evidence of what occurred beneath. In the post-war years, governments and local authorities had to navigate a path between safety, repair, and remembrance. Some sites became protected memorials, their subterranean stories open to the public in careful, contextualized exhibitions. Others were treated as hazardous ruins to be cordoned and occasionally inspected. The people who performed those inspections, geologists, custodians, engineers, became unsung intermediaries between past and present. Their reports recorded leaks and subsidence. Their presence preserved the potential for future study. Their role, at its heart, was what the clipboard man at the ruin performs now, a ritual of accountability, a small act of watching over what remains sealed. It is worth hearing how a professional with responsibility at one such site frames the duty. A state geologist who has made periodic inspections for decades, recorded in bureaucratic logs, and whose name appears in maintenance files, describes the work as not just measuring cracks, but measuring our failure to forget. He speaks plainly about the practicalities: water infiltration, shifting ground, the slow corrosion of metal. But he also speaks of the moral weight. Keeping a sealed site intact is, in his view, a form of guardian work. The inspections are not dramatic. They consist of climbing, measuring, and paperwork. But when the man writes his notes and locks the hatch again, he does so knowing that the sealed room he protects is a witness. The promise he keeps is less theatrical than a public ceremony. It is the promise of custody, the pledge that what lies beneath will not be erased simply by the passage of years. This care is not merely hypothetical. In archival correspondence preserved in state repositories, there are notes about commitments made to survivors groups and to investigative teams, promises to preserve access, to document, and where appropriate, to allow memorial visits. Those commitments, often lodged years after hostilities ended, carried with them both bureaucratic and human obligations.
They required funding and attention in the face of competing priorities: housing reconstruction, economic recovery, and the simple human tendency to move forward. For survivors and their families, however, that forward movement could feel like erasure. A sealed hatch could look, in a photograph, like an official choosing to hide pain rather than to confront it. A state's promise to monitor and preserve a site becomes an ethical barometer. Is the site being kept in careful watch, or is its sealing a way to bury inconvenient truths? The narrative students of the period confront another paradox. The very act of preserving a sealed space can prolong danger. Many of these places contained unstable structures, unexploded ordnance, chemical residues, and the physical evidence of forced labor that presented health risks to the uninformed. For this reason, the decision to leave a site sealed and to restrict public access often rested on public safety considerations as much as memory. The custodian's clipboard reflected both sets of concerns: archival care and hazard mitigation. Maintenance practices, occasional openings, gas readings, structural surveys, were part of a choreography that sought to balance remembrance with risk. The people undertaking that choreography often worked in anonymity. Their reports, stored in state archives, became the textual counterparts to the concrete plugs, making visible the careful, sometimes tedious labor of preservation. As one moves from the technical to the human, the stories accumulate in particular kinds of documents: survivor depositions, engineering logs, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and the minutes of post-war meetings where officials debated what to do with the empty caverns. It is feared that the names of engineers, von Braun, Speer, and of SS construction heads, Kammler, appear alongside the anonymous names of those who dug and fell ill underground. The juxtaposition is stark. One side of the ledger records ambition and administrative orders, the other, human expense. The moral account does not balance easily. At this point in our story, we need to step back and consider a different kind of evidence: the images that Allied reconnaissance returned. Photographs taken from hundreds of feet above the earth show in surprising detail the scale of activity below. Analysts compared shadows and earthworks, estimated volumes of concrete, and tried to match visible surface features with known engineering plans. Those images shaped Allied decisions: where to focus raids, what to target with precision attacks, and which sites presented intolerable risk if left intact. One squadron, 617, developed a reputation for precision strikes. Their operations demonstrated a strategic willingness to remove capabilities from the enemy's grasp, even at considerable cost. Bombing, when expertly applied, could crater unfinished domes or sever essential supply lines.
Those interventions did not make the human cost disappear. They sometimes exacerbated it, leaving workers trapped or slowing rescue efforts. The calculus of war is crude and tragic in that way. A tactical success on the map can be a human catastrophe in a tunnel. Back above ground, as the last shells fell silent and occupation governments took inventory, the practical choices about these subterranean sites multiplied. Local authorities, material teams, and military engineers surveyed conditions and began to decide what to leave open, what to make safe, and what to lock away. Sealing was, in part, a pragmatic decision. A concrete plug is inexpensive compared to the long-term investment necessary to make a cavern safe and accessible. It prevents collapse, it tampers down unauthorized exploration, and it reduces immediate liability. But sealing is also symbolic. It can look like silence. For families of victims, it can feel like a final erasure. For historians and custodians who genuinely seek to preserve, sealing is a placeholder, a protective gesture that buys time for future, more considered decisions. The man with the clipboard knows these nuances intimately. He opens documents the way others open windows, with the intention to let light in where darkness has settled. In his pocket, a photograph sometimes slips free, an old black and white image of men in stripped uniforms marching past a pit where foundations were being laid. A handwritten note tucked among his inspection forms, "Keep it safe." The note is unsigned, perhaps left by a survivors' organization decades ago, perhaps added by a bureaucrat who sensed the ethical imperatives that formal memos could not quite express. Whatever its origin, the scrawl has lodged in his routine. It is the promise that has accrued to his job over time. Someone, at some point, asked the state to watch over a place where people were forced to work and die, and the state said, in a series of administrative acts, that it would. There is a difference between the bureaucratic promise and the personal vow. Bureaucracy can sign a paper and record a date. Personal vows endure in other ways. They take the form of a survivor who, at a later time, returns to the landscape to see that the stone is still there. They appear as families who request an official plaque. They surface as the steady routine of a custodian who makes the climb at regular intervals to check the seal. That private sense of obligation may not make a headline, but it shapes how the sealed room is treated, as a hazard to be contained, as evidence to be archived, or as a place of memory to be honored. We can examine one documented example of such custodial insistence without inventing details where records do not support them. An archival file preserved in a regional repository contains correspondence between occupation authorities and a local municipal office concerning an underground factory site.
The documents show deliberations about whether to open the site to investigators, to cordon it, or to seal it. In the end, the decision favored sealing combined with minimal access for official inspections. A geologist appointed to perform these inspections later recorded his impressions. The site was dangerous, the structural integrity compromised. Yet the most pressing impression, he wrote, was the palpable absence, as if the concrete itself had been poured not just to secure stone, but to shut out testimony. He concluded that ongoing supervision was necessary to prevent both physical danger and historical erasure. That phrase, historical erasure, captures the dual function of the plug as both a safety device and a moral test. It is precisely this moral test that brings us, in the present day, to the slope beside the ruin. The custodian ascends with keys, clipboard, and the knowledge that there is a ceremony of attention to be performed. He is not slated for a public unveiling or a grand memorial. His work will be quiet, recorded in a ledger, and perhaps later filed away. Still, there is movement toward a small act of commemoration. A visiting delegation from a survivors' association will be present this afternoon. They are not here to reclaim the site for spectacle. They come to place a modest plaque beside the sealed hatch and to hear publicly the state's pledge that this place will remain documented, maintained, and remembered. For many of those visitors, the plaque will be a small but significant answer to a long silence. Before the delegation arrives, the man performs the inspection. He crouches at the hatch, wipes away moss with the back of his hand, feels the temperature of the metal. He checks the dated stamp. He records that the seal is intact, that there are no new fissures, that the site is secure. He writes each observation in neat, careful script. He is aware that the ritual he performs will be read by people who cannot come to the hill and feel that cold metal themselves. The document is a bridge between the physical act of watching and the moral undertaking of ensuring that others know the watch continues. If this story matters to you, take a moment to subscribe and follow the investigation. The longer arc is about how memory is preserved and why these decisions still matter. Even as we watch the modern custodian, the narrative pulls back to the immediate past, the wartime rush to push industry underground. Plans show not only concrete domes and cavern halls, but long galleries for ball-bearing production, machines mounted on rails, and the logistical arteries, narrow-gauge tracks, supply dumps, and ventilation shafts necessary to keep a subterranean economy functioning. In some sites, ball-bearing production, essential for military machinery, was targeted for relocation because it could be performed in enclosed spaces with predictable tolerances.
The ME-262 and its engines required a controlled environment for assembly. Rocket components, volatile and precise, demanded similar protections. The wartime planners thought in terms of continuity. If one plant were knocked out, another, buried and shielded beneath rock, could take its place. In practice, such continuity required not just concrete and machinery, but labor, materials, skilled technicians, and time, resources that were increasingly scarce. The human cost of assembling those elements was immediate and stark. Forced laborers, often housed in camps set apart from the protective walls of the tunnels themselves, suffered under conditions that accelerated illness and death. Medical care was rudimentary or absent. Harsh climates, cold, wet, and dust-ridden, did what neglect does: it wore bodies down. A composite testimony drawn from multiple survivors recalls guards indifferent to cries, shifts that shredded the will to speak, and the constant fear that a single collapse or bombing run could convert a hard day into a fatal one. These memories, preserved in survivor archives, form a third rail beneath the engineering feats. Without the testimony of those who lived it, the technical story risks becoming a chronicle of cold ingenuity, divorced from suffering. Those testimonies insist that any technical description carry the anchor of human consequence. In some installations, the machinery and the labor overlapped most tragically. Where armaments were assembled, workers were sometimes instructed, under threat, to continue operations even when the site was partially destroyed. Where production involved chemical experiments, IG Farben's facilities, and the more sinister projects that skirted into research on nerve agents, the danger extended beyond the immediate workforce to surrounding communities and to the post-war world. Documents unearthed after the war show that plans to research agents like sarin were part of a broader program of exploration. But crucially, documenting intention is not the same as enabling action. The historical record shows plans and possibilities, rather than a fully realized operational program at scale. Historians stress caution. The outline of a plan does not equate to its completion, and the ethical responsibility in describing such plans is to avoid instruction while conveying the risk they represented. As the wartime maps suggest, some sites were ultimately prevented from becoming fully operational through Allied action. Precision bombing, interdiction of supply lines, and the sheer attrition of war constrained what the subterranean projects could achieve. Yet not all were neutralized. Where sites remained intact enough to pose danger, Allied and post-war authorities took different paths. Some were dismantled, others sealed, and a few were left as open scars on the landscape to be studied. The choice among these options, dismantle, seal, or preserve, was never purely pragmatic. It always carried symbolic weight.
This brings us back, with renewed focus, to the sealed hatch and the small group arriving that afternoon. Among them are descendants of forced laborers, a representative from a survivors' association, a local historian, and a municipal official. They do not come as a press event. They come to repeat, through presence, the obligation recorded in the files, and to ensure the promise is publicly restated, that this place will not be forgotten. The custodian meets them at the gate with his clipboard and his routine language about structural integrity. But the conversation soon shifts from engineering minutiae to memory. The survivor's representative, whose hair is silver and whose hands have the trembling of age, speaks in a measured voice. He recalls a time when the hill was a place of noise and labor, when men were marched through gates and stripped of their names. He speaks not for theatricality, but to locate the event in human terms. The municipal official, clipped and careful, reads aloud the short text of a plaque drafted to accompany the sealed hatch, a declaration that names no individual guilty party, but obliges the present and future to remember those whose labor and lives were taken. As the visitors stand before the sealed concrete, their presence performs a ritual of reclamation. The plaque is modest. It will not open the hatch nor expose the chambers within. It will, however, make visible an official acknowledgement. The custodian watches as the plaque is affixed, screws turned into stone, and hands steady in the act. The inscription does not try to tell the whole story. It simply notes the existence of the facility, the forced labor connected to it, and the state's commitment to maintain the site and to facilitate scholarly access under safe and controlled conditions. The words are carefully chosen, historical, legal, precise, because there is a sense that precision will protect against either glorification or erasure. After the plaque is fixed, there is a brief moment of silence. Silence in this context is not emptiness, it is a living act of attention. One survivor in the group, drawing from a bank of recorded memories, reads a short composite passage that has been prepared for occasions like this. The voice is steady. They made us work in the dark. The work was hard. Many did not come back. It is a line built from the textures of many testimonies, not a fabrication of a life. This is the careful balance memorial practice demands, to put a human voice forward while respecting the particularities and privacy of survivors. The words land on the stone. The man with the clipboard feels as if the promise his predecessors had signed on paper has been transposed into a public physical act. The act of placing the plaque, of recording the inspection, and of hearing a survivor's voice is not by itself a resolution. It does not undo harm, nor does it produce definitive justice.
But it fulfills a promise of a specific sort, that the site will remain visible in official memory, that the sealed room will not simply be left to crumble into silence, and that future researchers will have, at minimum, the documentation needed to understand what occurred there. The promise is procedural and symbolic. It acknowledges a moral debt that cannot be paid in full, but can be addressed through continued attention. Even with the plaque in place, practical questions remain. Who will fund ongoing inspections? How will access be managed for scholars and families? What public educational programs will be connected to the site, if any? These are not rhetorical queries. They are administrative realities that shape whether a promise becomes a long-term commitment or a momentary gesture. The custodian's ledger records the immediate answer. Funding is provisional. Inspections will continue at set intervals. But it also contains a sequence of caveats that point toward future debates in town halls and state offices. The promise has been made. Its keeping will require vigilance. At the same time, the sealed room continues to symbolize broader obligations beyond any single plaque. It stands for a category of decisions that national and local actors must make about the remnants of atrocity, to study and interpret them, to contextualize them in curricula and museums, to respect the privacy and dignity of victims, and to ensure that scientific or historical interest never eclipses the moral imperative at the core. The sealed hatch thus functions as a focal point for ongoing ethical work. It demands that future generations not only learn technical facts about wartime production, but be confronted by the human consequences embedded in those stones. As the afternoon wanes and the visitors depart, the man with the clipboard lingers. He locks the small hatch, attaches the inspection tag, and writes the day's date in the ledger. He understands that his actions, small, procedural, often invisible, are part of a longer chain of custody that stretches forward and backward in time. The sealed room beneath the ruin will remain, for now, both a hazard and a memorial, a technical artifact and a moral test. The promise has been restated in public, the plaque fixed in place, but the work of keeping that promise, of funding, studying, remembering, and safeguarding, continues. We will return to this slope and to the sealed hatch, but first the story pulls us back to the wartime layers that made this place necessary. The planning offices, the railway spur that once fed the site, the engineers who sketched the halls in pencil, and the nameless laborers who turned those drawings into stone. There are archival maps yet to be examined, intercepted communications to be unfolded, and testimonies to be heard that trace the threads between ambition and atrocity.
Only by moving through those layers can we see how a sealed room became, across decades, the locus of a promise that someone, often quietly, sometimes bureaucratically, has kept. The arc between underground construction and the modern ritual of commemoration is long and braided. To follow it is to witness how memory is crafted out of practical decisions, moral demands, and the painstaking work of those who refuse to let silence stand as an answer. The ledger at the custodian's knee grows heavier with entries that do not only measure rock and rust. In the weeks after the plaque is fixed, a small team arrives from the regional archive, an archivist, a war historian, and a young technician with a padded case for fragile film reels. They come to match paper to place, to make sure that what the stone hints at is recorded in ink and pixel. For them, the sealed hatch is an index entry that demands corroboration. Blueprints must be checked against aerial photos. Payroll lists must be cross-referenced with transport manifests. Oral histories must be located and cataloged. Their work turns a single local promise into a chain of documentary custody. Notes, scans, recorded interviews, and metadata that can travel across research desks and classrooms where the hill itself cannot. The archival project reveals patterns familiar to specialists: orders routed through armaments ministries, procurement requests for concrete and rebar, ration cards and correspondence noting the movement of labor detachments from camps to construction sites. Names appear in files, some high and bureaucratic, others washed out or anonymous. Albert Speer's signature motifs, his insistence on continuity of production, show alongside engineering diagrams that could be read by a draftsman. Ventilation shafts with dimensions, access corridors sloping at precise angles, galleries designed to accommodate rails and trucks. Close study of reconnaissance photographs, taken from various altitudes and angles, lets analysts triangulate what the drawings propose and what the Earth shows. Where the maps promise a cavern for engines, the photos show a ring of disturbed soil and the faint trace of scaffolding. Where planners imagined assembly lines, the surface shows only a scar and the ghost of a rail spur fading into scrub. These documents also illuminate the decisions that followed the Allied assaults.
The RAF 617 Squadron, whose dam busters operation is the most widely known among their missions, was one of several targeted units used to strike with relative precision at hardened or strategic points. Reconnaissance and intelligence guided those raids. Analysts prioritized hubs that, if disrupted, would cripple broader supply or production networks. Bombing could collapse supports, flood excavations, or detonate stored materials. It could also leave the subterranean skeleton intact but unserviceable.
In some cases, raids were deliberately aimed to render sites unusable rather than to inflict immediate civilian casualties. Yet the human calculus was never clean. Men forced to labor below ground were sometimes trapped by explosions or left in ruins where care could not reach them. Those choices haunt the records. They do not admit easy moral accounting. Post-war files show early tensions about what to do with the raw remains. Military teams surveyed sites for salvageable equipment. Occupation authorities debated whether certain technologies might be useful to them. The question of personnel followed. Engineers who once designed assembly halls for jets or rockets were interrogated, courted, or recruited, depending on the occupying power and its priorities. The U.S. and Britain, among others, moved to secure technical expertise and material, sometimes shipped to workshops and test stands across oceans. Werner von Braun and other rocket engineers, for instance, would later become part of programs that built on their wartime work. Historians note their movements as part of a fraud post-war transfer of knowledge. The transfer was pragmatic. Cold War anxieties intensified interest in rocketry, but it also raised ethical questions that persisted for decades. What moral weight attaches to expertise forged within a criminal regime? At the same time, the physical sites themselves were assessed for immediate danger. Many caverns contained unstable timbering, chemical residues of experiments, and unexploded ordnance. For local authorities, short on funds and long on problems of reconstruction, the cheapest, quickest, and safest option was often sealing. Concrete plugs could be poured in a single operation. They could secure unstable mouths and reduce the hazard of accidental entry. But sealing also deferred the harder work of reading the site, careful excavation, forensic accounting, and the building of interpretive frameworks for public understanding. Sealing was therefore both a technical compromise and a moral gesture subject to interpretation. The archivists who now examine the files find a succession of small promises and compromises. Letters from occupation administrations note that documentation should be preserved for future legal or historical examination. Municipal records show that some local councils put forward proposals for memorials or controlled access, only to see budgets devoured by housing projects, by the need to repair bridges and reopen factories. Records of survivors' associations are sometimes brittle. Typed letters asking for memorials, for the names of missing relatives to be recorded, for access so families might lay flowers. The state's responses vary, from warm procedural language to procedural postponement. In some cases, the promise to keep watch is explicit. In many others, it is implicit in inspection protocols and in the maintenance ledger kept by the custodian who still climbs the slope.
The archivists bring film reels to the light. Poorly exposed wartime footage flickers into view. Men in hard hats, trucks backing into cuttings, concrete being poured in layers around timber formwork. In one sequence, an engineer gestures toward plans spread on a crate. In another, a column of workers disappears down a hillside mouth, and the camera holds on the closed gate. The young technician digitizes each frame, noting timecode and condition. The historian tags the images, probable site, approximate dates, and where possible, the unit or company involved. Each image is a little world of verification, a hand-stamped crate, a machine part, a knitted detail of a uniform that helps place it in a transport roster. Together, these pieces allow researchers to reconstruct who did what, when, and under what conditions. The reconstruction is partial and deliberate. Historians are careful not to overclaim from a single frame, but the pattern grows sharper. As the documentary record solidifies, it also sharpens ethical considerations. The presence of technical expertise in the post-war period raises questions about how societies remember and which narratives become dominant. When rocket engineers were taken to Allied programs, when chemical research notes were cataloged and then classified or destroyed, when some sites were opened and others buried, the choices shaped collective memory. Erasure is not only physical, it is archival. A sealed hatch can hide a chamber. A redacted file can obscure complicity. The act of preservation, of creating public, accessible records, thus becomes itself an act of moral repair. These are not abstract debates for those who survived the camps and the forced labor system. A visiting survivor, identified in archives and present at the plaque ceremony, speaks directly to the assembled group in the weeks that follow. He is careful with words, distancing any claim of triumph from what he says. "We wanted someone to know," he tells the small crowd, "that we were there, that we were forced to make things we were not allowed to say were wrong. This plaque tells others that our work and our loss is recorded." His voice breaks only once. The rest of the sentence is kept quiet. The recording of his statement is preserved, cataloged, and made available to scholars under safeguards that respect privacy and context. The survivor's words become part of the archived promise. The testimony will be preserved, and that the sealed room will not be allowed to be a place where memory dies by bureaucratic neglect. The technical teams who advise the municipality provide sobering counsel. They reiterate that any opening of the sealed chamber would require phased remediation, surveys for gas, shoring up of supports, removal of hazardous detritus. The costs would be high. The timeline would be measured in years, not months.
Some local politicians propose turning the site into a museum. Others prefer a minimalist approach: leave the plug, improve signage, fund scholarship. The debate is not trivial. It forces the community to decide what kind of memory it seeks to cultivate: an active, curated education center that invites confrontation with history, or a guarded preservation that limits access for safety and conservational reasons. There is no single right answer. There is only an ongoing ethical labor. In the months following the plaque's installation, the state archives approve a small grant to digitize and make public certain categories of documents related to underground wartime construction. The grant is modest compared to the costs of remediation, but it carries symbolic weight. The state is making an explicit investment in information as a form of remembrance. The custodian is given a small additional allocation so that inspections can be more frequent and more thorough. The municipal council agrees to host, in partnership with a regional university, a public lecture series on wartime forced labor and industrial policy. Those steps do not compensate for loss. They do, however, expand the means by which memory can be taught and debated. The promise that had accumulated in the custodian's ledger finds another form of fulfillment beyond the plaque: the public record. During a recorded meeting in a municipal office, the mayor reads a formal statement into the archive, a commitment to preserve the site, to maintain restricted but documented access for researchers, and to consult survivors and their descendants on future interpretive plans. The words are bureaucratic and precise. Their careful legal phrasing is designed to survive political turnover and budget cycles. Afterward, the statement is signed, witnessed, and given an archival reference number. It becomes, in effect, a contractual promise. The state is not simply declaring its intention. It is committing itself on paper, a document as durable as the concrete plug itself. The custodian sits through these meetings. He knows well that a signed promise is not the same as daily attention. In his ledger, the new commitments are another set of lines to be followed. He files the mayor's statement and attaches a note: inspections to be quarterly, access by appointment, funds for digitization confirmed. He also makes a personal mark in the margins: visit to Survivors Association to be scheduled. In doing so, he connects the formalities of state action to the human relationships that give them meaning. The sealed room, then, is both a physical object and a node in a network of obligations: legal, archival, moral, and interpersonal. Scholars weigh in too.
A historian working on the wider question of underground wartime industry publishes an essay that situates the sealed site within broader patterns: the redirection of labor resources, the role of private firms in wartime construction, and the post-war contested terrain of technological appropriation. The piece is careful. It avoids sweeping conclusions about what might have changed the war's outcome, and instead focuses on the interplay between expertise, coercion, and memory. It argues that remembering the sealed sites is not just an exercise in forensic curiosity, but a civics task to teach future engineers, policymakers, and citizens the ethical dimensions of technological work. The article returns repeatedly to the image of the concrete plug as a moral test, an object that asks whether societies will confront difficult pasts or hide them beneath pragmatic decisions. At community meetings, questions surface that are not easily answered. A descendant of a forced laborer asks how names might be included in the memorial record. Another resident worries about the stigma of being the community with the underground factory. School teachers inquire about curricula, and the Regional Historical Society volunteers to lead tours, if and when the site can safely receive visitors. These conversations are fraught but necessary. They illustrate how local memory and national history intersect, and how a promise made in municipal minutes touches people's lives beyond the hilltop. The custodian continues his rounds, each time more aware that his role is not merely maintenance, but caretaking of commemoration. He takes extra care when he writes the dates in his ledger. He arranges for an off-site digital copy of the inspection forms to be stored in the state archive. He arranges with the archivist for the surviving films to be copied and hosted under public access, with appropriate restrictions to protect identities. Small acts, perhaps, but they accumulate. They transform the sealed room from a forgotten hazard into a site of layered responsibility. On a crisp autumn afternoon, a research team visits with a condition report that offers a pathway between sealing and access, phased remediation that would allow a controlled, limited opening for scholarly work. The plan is precise about necessary shoring, gas monitoring, and the timescale of work. The team emphasizes that any excavation must be guided by forensic sensitivity to prioritize the dignity of human remains, to respect privacy, and to prevent sensationalism. The Municipal Council votes to approve a pilot phase, subject to matching funds from regional cultural grants. The decision is tentative and contested, but it is a step beyond symbolic gestures. It signals a willingness to invest in the work of truth-telling and an acknowledgement that promises can require resources as well as words. Preparations begin. Contractors with expertise in stabilizing aging subterranean spaces draw plans.
Historians prepare research protocols and ethical guidelines. Survivors' representatives insist on being consulted at every step. They ask for sensitivity to their experiences and for clear rules about media access. The custodian, who will coordinate the on-the-ground logistics, insists on creating a modest visitor center to host families and researchers in a dignified space before any descent. The image of a sealed hatch begins to be transformed, not into spectacle, but into a controlled, respectful portal to study and remembrance. When the first controlled inspection is scheduled within the sealed chamber, it is not a theatrical unveiling. A small team, geologists, structural engineers, 2 historians, and a representative from a survivor association, descend briefly under tightly managed conditions. Access is limited, documented, and filmed for archival purposes under strict agreements. Their work is forensic and sober, measuring, mapping, and collecting safe, non-invasive samples that might tell more about the environment and the conditions workers endured. The meets and greets out front are modest. The municipal mayor and the archivist observe, and later each file an account in their records. What might have been a media event becomes instead a technical and ethical exercise in presence. The visit yields no sensational discovery, no hidden caches or shocking revelations. What it does produce is testimony, measured observations, corroborations of documentary records, and a set of digital images that, once cataloged, become resources for future teaching and research. More important, the visit is a tangible fulfillment of the promise that has accumulated over decades. The sealed room will be preserved, not as an eraser, but as an object of study and as a memorial for those whose labor made it possible. That fulfillment is small in the face of loss, but it matters. It converts bureaucratic commitment into an act of responsibility that can be witnessed, recorded, and passed on. In the aftermath, the Municipal Archive establishes a public portal linking digitized documents, survivor testimonies, and contextual essays to the physical site. A cautious but determined educational program is piloted with local schools. Scholars begin to reference the collection in articles examining forced labor, wartime industrial policy, and the ethics of technological transfer. The custodian's ledger continues to list inspections, but now it also records visits by students, coordination meetings with historians, and notes on how to make the site more accessible while safeguarding dignity and safety. There is no grand closure. The plaque remains fixed to the cold stone, the sealed hatch still bears its inspection stamp and the rust of seasons. Yet there is also a record, agreements signed, documents digitized, and periodic inspections scheduled in perpetuity.
For many who visit, for survivors and for their descendants, the moment matters not because it righted past wrongs, but because it refused to let them be silently buried. The promise made decades earlier, sometimes in bureaucratic language, and sometimes in the quiet insistence of a custodian's routine, has been translated into acts that sustain memory. As dusk settles over the ruin, the custodian walks the slope one last time. The day's light softens the concrete plug and the plaque beside it. The man pauses, lays a small bouquet of field flowers at the base, an old habit learned from visits with families, and runs his gloved hand once more over the inspection tag before locking the small hatch and closing the ledger. He is not a man of publicity. He is an agent of continuity. His work will continue, inspections scheduled,
archives updated, and committees convened. The promise, finally kept in public and formal ways, requires ongoing attention to remain alive. The sealed room under the ruins still waits, sealed against casual entry, open to study under careful protocols, and acknowledged in public record. Its concrete face is not a tombstone, but an invitation to look, to read, and to remember. The moral of the place is not contained in the precision of engineering drawings or in the novelty of wartime innovations. It is held in the small, sustained acts of people who chose, again and again, to keep watch. Those acts, archival preservation, periodic inspections, ethical research, survivor consultations, compose a long civic promise that some things, no matter how difficult, will not be allowed to be erased. If you want to learn more about the records and survivor testimonies that inform stories like this, check the links in the description for reputable archives, oral history collections, and memorial resources. History matters in the daily work of remembrance. Keeping watch is a practice, and it requires resources and attention. The sealed room beneath the old ruin is a quiet witness, still closed, still concrete, but no longer forgotten. It stands as a reminder that promises can be kept, slowly and imperfectly, by those willing to do the work of memory.